A lot of art from the Middle Ages is so bizarre it seems beyond explanation. Which is why it's no surprise that these seemingly nonsensical images have become popular sources of memes in recent years. It's hard not to look at these visuals and ask yourself, wait, what is going on here? So for this entry into the archive, I'll try to track down the real meaning behind some of these images which have circulated on the internet without context. But keep in mind that what I've found in my research is that for many illustrations, medieval art historians are just as clueless as the rest of us. With that said, let's begin. To start, we have the curious trend of medieval babies who look a little off. The sheer amount of unfortunate-looking babies in medieval and later Renaissance art suggests more is going on than just a few misplaced brushstrokes. Portraits of medieval infants seem like they were intentionally styled to look like tiny, middle-aged men. And indeed, that is more or less what's going on here. These artists are following the trend of the homunculus, which translates to little man in Latin. The idea behind the homunculus is related to the baby Jesus, who was the most popular infant to paint at the time. Due to a very literal interpretation of the church's idea that Jesus was born fully formed and unchanged, a lot of classic religious art from the era has a very adult-faced Jesus. And paintings of other infants started to follow this trend as well, hence babies being painted with receding hairlines and layers of muscle. By the time Renaissance styles developed over more of Europe, however, the somewhat unsettling trend of adult-faced infants went out of practice, and frescoes thankfully started featuring much more normal-looking babies. Switching topics, another unusual theme in medieval art that the internet has picked up on is that in scenes of people meeting their untimely demise, which should be pretty grim, the sufferers seem strangely laid back. Seriously, all of these people seem pretty chill about their imminent death, all things considered. In fact, a lot of them appear somewhat bored or at most subtly annoyed by the situation, which is an unusual reaction to such a serious event. So why are there entire battle scenes where everyone seems completely checked out? Well, one explanation is that the neutral expressions come from the cultural value of greeting death with a calmness so you'll be rewarded in what comes after. While staying calm and grounded can be healthy, I will say I think some of these people might be taking their chillness a little too far. And while we're on the subject of strange portrayals of death, death itself, as personified by skeletal figures coming to haunt the living, often looked a little goofier than one might expect, which has led to a variety of jokes online. Most of these illustrations are actually related to the concept of the danse macabre, or dance of death. The danse macabre was a concept that death was an equalizer, coming for all classes of feudal society. The images were designed to remind people to see this life's fleeting nature and to embrace death when the time came. A related, and also strangely amusing, image that has become popular online is this portrait of three individuals having a bizarre reaction to a group of skeletons. The image is actually based on a legend called The Three Living and the Three Dead, in which three nobles encounter three skeletons who are actually undead reflections of the nobles, sent to frighten them into changing their immoral ways. It's a pretty unique tale with a lot of variations and one which shows up a fair amount in medieval art. Moving on, one particularly strange trend in medieval art that has captured some attention online is how some artists depicted rabbits. Various manuscripts portray rabbits not as we know them, as small fuzzy animals that aren't much of a threat to a human, but as large threatening creatures carrying off helpless villagers. It's a concept that certainly stands out in the margins of illuminated texts. So what is going on here? Are these some kind of mythical beasts? Did rabbits have some kind of attitude problem in the Middle Ages? Well, the most accepted theory is that these strange, hilarious images are meant to be just that, jokes. Just like how we share funny images today, this sort of bizarre art was probably something medieval monks had a laugh about with their friends. And yes, this trend is somewhat similar to Monty Python's famous deadly rabbit.
Look, that rabbit's got a vicious streak a mile wide. It's a killer.
Briefly leaving the medieval era for a series of portraits I felt I had to include, we have the highly unusual 18th century self-portraits of French painter Joseph de Croix. Although trained in the classical style, the successful de Croix became unsatisfied with the constraints of traditional portraiture, which at the time were almost entirely serious, with somber body language and reserved compositions. So de Croix started creating art with absurd, larger-than-life expressions that really go against the standards of the time. In breaking these constraints, his works actually resemble the earlier 16th and 17th century style of portraiture called tronies, which were paintings like the one you see before you that frequently featured exaggerated facial expressions. Some of these expressions are so unusual that it might seem hard to believe they aren't modern parodies. But despite what most classical portraits might lead you to believe, some people from the past had a very modern sense of humor, and de Croix was certainly one of those people. Today, his most famous image is probably this one, where he painted himself pointing at viewers and laughing at them. It says something that this image is still funny to people on the internet hundreds of years after it was painted. Before we reach our final topic, there are a few other miscellaneous drawings I'd like to try and address. First, we have this amusing illustration of what seems to be a mythical bird monster carrying a smaller creature and a human away on its back. And the two passengers appear so deep in argument they haven't noticed they're being hoisted away. Despite appearances, this isn't a medieval illustration, but a depiction of a costumed individual at a 17th century fair, with the figures on their back likely some kind of puppets. Pretty unusual. Next, we have this image of a man who seems like he's being wrapped up in a sheet by his friends. Despite the goofy vibe, this image is likely Vitalis of Milan, a saint who, according to legend, was sentenced to death. So those two aren't his friends, but his executioners, in all likelihood lowering him into his grave. And finally, on a lighter note, we've got this famously weird portrait of a baby. And no, this isn't one of those bizarre medieval era portraits, but a stylized portrait by the 20th and 21st century figurative artist Fernando Botero, whose unique style sometimes causes people to assume his work was painted centuries prior. And closing out this entry into the archive, we have a topic I've touched on in the past but is always worth revisiting, that being the bizarre medieval trend of depicting knights fighting snails. You can find these bizarre showdowns hidden within the margins of many manuscripts. There's a strangeness here that is pretty apparent. I mean, snails don't seem like the most obvious creatures to depict as gargantuan, menacing juggernauts. And maybe I'm overanalyzing, but to me, there's a sense in these images that the knights might not make it. These snails seem like they mean business. And this wasn't a one-off concept. We have over 65 documented images of snails doing battle with various warriors. And what's most intriguing is that we're not totally sure why, with theories ranging from the snails representing class divisions to being a joke about the concept of a knight's armor to a metaphoric personification of the slow and steady approach of death. Or maybe this is just another example of medieval artists trying to create something to make their friends laugh, just like what we do online today. And that's all the weird medieval art we have time for in this entry. I made other videos covering unusual medieval depictions of animals and mythical creatures that explain additional bizarre illustrations I didn't get to here. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this entry, please lend your support and like, subscribe, and hit the notification icon to stay up to date on all things curious. See you in the next video.